welcome everybody. It is Wednesday, a stormy, windy, rainy day outside, so we hope you're staying dry and able to watch this video in a secure spot, perhaps with dinner or a cup of coffee. So Gary and I are here today. It's been a couple weeks since we've been here. We want to give you some updates, and Gary, let's just jump right in, but with a twist today. We're not starting with COVID, but starting with some other things. So Gary, I'll toss it to you.
So, it's been a while since we've gotten together. It feels like forever. It feels like a month. But so we thought we just want to update people on what's mainly happened with the 3 respiratory viruses right now.
Okay.
So let's start with the good news, because it's already been a pretty rough season. I'm going to start with RSV. Let me show you the first slide for RSV. So this comes from California Department of Health, and you can see that our RSV numbers are going down. That's the good news. So RSV is on the decline, which is really good. And RSV, unlike we talked about last time, is unlikely to have a bimodal hump. So hopefully RSV will go down and remain down. California, 82 deaths in RSV, which is really kind of sad. And 64 of those 82 were in over people 65 years of age. So we talked about that last time. The elderly, it's much more dangerous for. I had a patient in the office yesterday with RSV. It was rough for them. They really had this prolonged wheezing and prolonged cough. So RSV is on the decline. That's the good news. The next one is, let's move to the flu. So this comes from CDPH as well, and as it shows that the percentage of flu positive swabs is down to 17%. Kind of peaked at about 23, 24%. It's down to 17%. I hope that means that the flu has gone down. And in this slide, you can see that's the dark blue line. So what's circulating? 99% or more is influenza A, and the vast majority is H3N2. And H3N2 is a rough virus. It can be more severe. It matches well with the vaccine this year, but it can be really rough. And that's why on the next slide, I'll show you the fatality rate of influenza. And as you can see, even though influenza cases are going down, swabs are going down, there's this lag time, and mortality is still at the peak. So hospitalizations are still up, and people are still dying of influenza. In California, about 303 people so far have died of influenza. 238 of those over 65, and there's been 6 pediatric deaths with influenza, and one of those pediatric deaths was in Sonoma County. So influenza hopefully will be on the decline soon. I think we're at the peak right now.
Although it's not uncommon for us to see a bimodal peak with that January, February with influenza.
Yeah, and it's kind of good because going back to the slides we showed for the positive slides, other years are presented in this slide, and you can see that in 2017 and 18, in 2018 and 19, those were both bimodal years, where we had an early rise in influenza and then a second peak. Now our rise is so early this year, I think it would not be surprising to have a bimodal hump later on in the season, which is probably going to be a different one, maybe an influenza B, maybe H1N1A, but we could see a bimodal hump.
Okay.
So a couple things, and the reason why I presented the flu data in some detail is in the news, and I'll show this on the next slide, today said, oh, can't find Tamiflu, shortages, pharmacies are running out, Tamiflu and amoxicillin in early December were in short supply in parts of the country. I think Minnesota, Wisconsin had some issues there. And then in late December, the Biden administration released Tamiflu from the national stockpile. So I called around to the pharmacies and a couple of our colleagues here. We're not seeing Tamiflu, which is also Tamiflu. We're not seeing shortages in our local area. So that's the good news. If patients come in to you and ask you, do we have enough Tamiflu? I want some just in case. I need some because I might be going on a trip. You don't need to do that. We're not having a shortage of Tamiflu here. But I wanted to put as just kind of a mention to the docs, what are the treatments for influenza? So there's 3 outpatient treatments, also Tamiflu, which is Tamiflu. That's a 5-day pill. Baloxavir, which is Xofluza. That's a pill that you take once. And then Zanamivir, which is the inhaler. No one uses a lot because it causes bronchospasm in people with emphysema, COPD, and asthma. And then at the very bottom I put, what we could use in the hospital is Peramivir IV. But if we were short on also Tamiflu, which is Tamiflu, then we would move to Baloxavir. And there's plenty of that in the country as well as locally. But again, we're not having a shortage here. This is only for edification, so the docs have a reminder of, what ages, what doses, and just to use as a reference.
That's certainly new medicine to me. Is it new, or is it just not been used?
So baloxavir was approved, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
But we've never needed to reach for it.
Yeah, we've got generic old town.
It was produced in Japan, so Japan used a lot of it, and people were worried that it has a different mechanism of action, that if we see Tamiflu resistance, baloxavir will still work.
Okay.
So it's good to have that backup drug, but we haven't really needed to use it in the world or in the US.
Okay.
It's a one-dose thing though, one dose and done. And I'll let you kind of talk about COVID.
All right, so next slide is our typical opening slide. We see our COVID cases, and remember, this just has a 1-day lag. So the last time we talked to you, we were just showing that peak that occurred at least a couple of weeks ago, and subsequently went down a little bit, and that was probably after that is Christmas. So this rise we've had most recently was probably Christmas, and now you can see we're starting the hint of a trajectory going back down again. So it's good news, although if you put this in perspective, it's still running a pretty high baseline from previous years. So this is local Sutter data. Gary, what we read a lot about China, and I'm not really up to date on what's happening in the rest of the world with COVID.
So a couple of things happened with China, which put it in the forefront of international news. One is, all of a sudden, the Chinese National Health Commission said, we're not going to report our data. We're overwhelmed and we're not going to report our data. And the world's like, oh my gosh, what's happening in China? Yeah. And it created a lot of consternation. And so as we found out, the good news is there are no new variants coming out of China right now. And that was the real concern. Yeah. If there's so much happening in China, why are they having such a boost now? And could that be a new variant? Well, the answer is no new variants so far. So right now, what's circulating in China is BF7, BA5, and BQ1. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Okay. But so what happened in China? Remember, China has a population of 1.4 billion. And we in the US, 330 million. Yes. So China's 4 times our size. And it's 4 times our size in a country that was so restricted with their public health restrictions. I wouldn't even go beyond public health restrictions. And when they lifted those, there was going to be more viral circulation. And also China used vaccines that they made kind of homegrown. So they didn't have very good vaccines. I mean, we had the best vaccine in the world with the mRNA platform. China did not. In fact, they released a nasal vaccine that really didn't work. So now you have this poorly vaccinated country, 4 times our size, lifting restrictions. It was an expected mushroom. And so the only thing to know from a physician's perspective is the United States, Australia, and Canada are requiring patients coming from China to test before they enter the US or those other countries. So that's the only thing to know for a clinical thing. But no new variants out of China. It's just kind of the dynamics of viral population in an area of poor vaccine,
It's good news for us.
Yeah. Now I'd also like to talk about, what about worldwide? We haven't really talked about this, so it's been going on for a long time. 660 million cases confirmed in the world, and there's been 6.7 million deaths. What about in the US? In the US, we've had 100 million confirmed cases, and we've had a million deaths, almost 1.1 million deaths in the US. California has seen 12 million cases, and we've had 101,000 deaths in California. So the thing about COVID is we don't have that many cases. Like right now, in our hospital, we have 3 RSV, 2 flus, and we have 12 COVIDs. And the COVID cases are mainly incidental. Yeah. They didn't get admitted with COVID, they happen to have it at the same time. And so we haven't seen any severe COVID in quite some time, which is really good. But in the US, about 300 patients or more are dying a day. So hundreds of patients in the US are still dying of COVID every day, which means the booster is really important. In the US, by October, 9% of people had their bivalent booster. Now in California, it's about 18%. So 18% of people boosted still isn't enough. Yeah. So please encourage your patients, get the bivalent booster. If you haven't had the bivalent booster, you're really not protected against the new Omicron strains. So let's talk a little bit about the phylogeny of COVID. I think this is interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I could spend all day on this. This is actually called a radial phylogeny tree. This is how a virologist looks at the evolution of SARS-CoV-2. The red dot in the middle kind of represents the start of it. And as you spiral out on this in a clockwise fashion, you can see that the beta, the delta, the alpha strains kind of had their different phylogeny and their different mutation, and every dot represents point mutations with a different strain. within that different substrain within that vein variant. Now, I'm going to put a big circle around the Omicron one. Now, the big circle represents, this is all the Omicron variants and subvariants and subvariants of that. Now, I'm going to put a couple labels on this. On the Omicron label, BA1, BA2, BA3, BA4, and BA5 were all sublineages of Omicron. And then from that, BA5 went to become BQ1. So BQ1 came out of BA5. And then what's really interesting is that BA2.1 and BA2.75, those actually merged and they had a recombinant strain called XXB. And so what I want to point out to the docs, and I'll do it on the next slide, is that what about these new strains? So XXB is the recombinant of BA2.10 and 2.75. That sounds scary. And that got a lot of press. This is the first time we've really seen a fusion that virus become prominent. And maybe if you had a different strain that wasn't Omicron, you would have a higher chance of getting the strain. That's kind of out there. I mean, most of us have seen the Omicron strain. Yeah. And then BQ1 is just a sublineage of BA51. It's becoming predominant. Here's the good news about these, so you can kind of tell your patients. One, they are more contagious, they're less severe. They're not more dangerous, they're actually less severe. So that's the good news. Yes, they are more contagious, but they're less severe. The bivalent vaccine covers them really well, so you're gonna get really good protection for that. We have not seen any resistance to the antiviral meds with these new strains. And the only bad news is that monoclonal antibody has kind of fallen off the wayside. The monoclonal antibodies we developed were so old that they really go for more of the older strains, not the new sublineages of Omicron. So monoclonal antibodies we're not using much effectively anymore, but the antivirals are still terrific.
So this is despite all the news, it's same old treatment in
Correct.
Clinical situation.
Right.
Good.
Now here's an interesting caveat for COVID. The NIH has 3 treatments, and I'll show these on the next slide. The NIH tells us first use Paxlovid as an outpatient, then use remdesivir for 3 days. If you can't use those, then use molnupiravir. Well, we haven't really been able to use remdesivir much in the nation, let alone in Sutter, because it's an IV treatment for the outpatient side. And then recently in Medscape, a new article came out that Paxlovid's going to have a sticker shock next year. So in mid-2023, the government stockpiles and what they provided for Paxlovid is going to go away. You're going to have to start paying for it. And right now, the government is paying $530 for a course of Paxlovid. So what do you think that's going to be? Because the government got this bulk rate. It's going to be somewhat higher than that. Well, what's interesting and this came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, is that there is an oral medication of remdesivir. So there's an oral form of remdesivir that will be effective for COVID, and maybe that'll have healthy competition with Paxlovid and drive the price down. So hopefully the 2 of those next year being options, and with molnupiravir will drive down the price of Paxlovid. But if you're hearing about that in the news, or you've seen that in the literature, and that's a New England Journal study recently, I thought you might find that interesting.
And this is starting to get airtime already.
Yeah.
Sal, Medicare, Medi-Cal patients in particular are going to get hit hard with treatments for, COVID when this runs out.
Right, and that's a problem because, because if something is EUA, it's not FDA approved, and Paxlovid is EUA, not FDA approved, then it doesn't cover Medicare Part D, so Medicare Part D doesn't work.
And it's a possibility that the sticker shock will Congress will act on that and extend the emergency too. They've done that before.
Yeah, I hope so. That would be really good. But I think Biden's produced a bill to kind of get more drug out there, and I don't think Congress is going to bite on drug or vaccine. Mm-hmm. So next year, when we have this combined flu COVID vaccine, it's probably going to be out of pocket again. So it'll probably be not a free vaccine as we see this year.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a lot of information for everybody, but the good news is, despite all the changes, what we're doing clinically has not changed. A lot of them continue to treat people in an ambulatory environment. It's contagious, but we're keeping it controlled with the medicines we have for both flu and COVID.
Right.
So clinically, everything's still pretty sound. So that's all we have today. Hope that was helpful. We will see you our next all-group meeting via Zoom or Teams from your living room in particular. We'll be next Tuesday evening. I think that's January 10, so we'll see you then.
Hey Gary, did you see Ferris Bueller?
Yes.
At the very end of Ferris Bueller, there's a little thing. Well, this is kind of like Ferris Bueller. We wanted to offer you a present for the upcoming year. So I wanted to prepare you, because we don't know what 2023 is going to be a part of. So sometime history repeats itself, And this is your preparation for the pandemic in the next year.
Oh boy,
You can open
it's
it.
too light for these on the wine. Lovely. A 6-pack. Thanks very much.
Just in case
Gary.
next year it gets
You're
kind of
so
harsh.
thoughtful. Thanks, everybody.